The week's end top stories at NBR. A new report starkly reveals the gender bias at play in New Zealand's investment scene. A government review into Airways New Zealand announced. Nothing wrong with Fonterra's financial statements, and there's more coming right up. Kia ora and welcome to NBR This Week. We start with a wrap of the end of the week's top business stories from the authority in New Zealand business news since 1970, nbr.co.nz. Then we'll take a look back at the top NBR stories for the past week. I'm Paul Brennan. Thank you for joining us. A new report starkly reveals the gender bias at play in New Zealand's investment scene and highlights seldom acknowledged pressures on women entrepreneurs from gendered role expectations at home. Comments by women in the study included the worst comment that I got from a high-profile angel investor was that I should tell people I'm single because I'd probably raise more capital. Study author Janine Swale of Auckland University's School of Business joined the NBR's Nicola Shepherd.
Unconscious bias was paramount, okay? More so than direct bias. There was some examples of direct conscious bias, but I would actually say that overall what the women were speaking to me about was the more subtle and more unconscious experiences, the microaggressions that they had to deal with.
The author of a new report revealing gender bias in New Zealand's investment scene, Janine Swale, with Nicola Shepherd. Airways New Zealand CEO Graham Sumner has welcomed a government review into the funding of his organisation and the provision of navigation infrastructure to the country's smaller airports, saying there are opportunities for improvement. Transport Minister Michael Wood announced today the government had decided to do a first principles review, looking at what we want for our air navigation system and how to provide it. Sumner told NBR that Airways had been aware of the ministry's recommendation for a review since it was made to the minister earlier this year. The Chief Financial Officer of NZX-listed insurer Tower has resigned after 5 years at the business to return home to Australia. Tower said in an NZX announcement today that Jeff Wright was leaving the business at the end of the year. A search has begun for his replacement. Wright has more than 30 years of experience in insurance and financial services, having held senior roles at Allianz and Suncorp in Australia. He was appointed Tower Chief Financial Officer in September 2017. A Financial Markets Authority review has found nothing wrong with Fonterra's financial statements after complaints about the co-op's valuation of China assets in its 2019 accounts. In a statement issued this morning, the FMA said it had closed its inquiry and did not find evidence to support regulatory action, including litigation, under the Financial Markets Conduct Act. The inquiry followed a warning of significant write-downs in the value of Fonterra's China Farms assets in an August 2019 market announcement. The 2019 accounts showed a $203 million impairment in the value of China Farms. The FMA said it received complaints about the timing of Fonterra's write-downs after the 2019 announcement. The High Court has upheld a decision by the professional body for insolvency practitioners rejecting membership to convicted tax fraudster Imran Mohammed Kamal, in an outcome effectively dimming his chances of securing future work. But the Restructuring, Insolvency and Turnaround Association of New Zealand has not won outright, with Auckland Judge Christine Gordon declaring the decision-maker made errors in coming to its verdict. Wellington-based Kamal, the Managing Director of Liquidation Management, sought to set aside Ritanz's decision, arguing it was legally flawed. Membership of the industry body is necessary for those insolvency practitioners who aren't chartered accountants to keep practicing once a new licensing regime comes into force in 2 months. Those are our top stories as we head into the weekend, the full versions of which, along with all our breaking business news, columns and opinion, are at nbr.co.nz right now. You're watching NBR This Week, a brief look back at the week's top stories from our daily news brief program, NBR Today. On Monday, the new owner of an Auckland house, previously owned by a bankrupt property developer, is left with a huge repair bill. The buyer of an Auckland house previously owned by bankrupt property developer Andrew Montgomery has been left with a huge repair bill after the mortgagee property was stripped of its fixtures and vandalised. When Finn Potter took over the $2.5 million Ponsonby home on June 24th after buying the house with his father, he discovered damage so extensive he's been unable to move in.
All around the house, every window, every door, all stripped with screws in them, so yeah, and then obviously found this as well, the kitchen the way it is. Everything's damaged, the blinds all cut off, the califont cut, no hot water. The marble bench tops and the kitchen island, they're both still here. They've just been smashed up. One of them's in the garden, just in a lot of pieces. custom blinds for those large windows. They've been smashed out. That's from my brother who's a builder, reckons that'll be a couple thousand. The heat pump that's taken off the wall, all the wires, pipes cut.
House buyer Finn Potter there. It's NBR This Week, the week's top stories from our daily video business news bulletin, NBR Today. From Tuesday, an Australian federal court rules a Tauranga Twitter user is not a journalist. A Tauranga Twitter user sued by a high-profile Australian businessman for alleged defamation is not a journalist and can't claim protection for a senior capital markets informant, the Australian Federal Court has ruled. Alan Davison, a self-styled citizen journalist, operates the Stock Swami Twitter account, offering news, gossip and a cynical and cranky take on ASX-listed companies and market participants. Mining investor Tolga Kumova, a former AFR Young Rich lister, is suing Davison in the Australian court for a series of tweets made on the Stock Swami profile between September 2019 and June 2020, which Kumova says accused him of insider trading, misleading the stock market, and involvement in pump and dump schemes. This is NBR This Week, the past week's top 5 stories from NBR Today. From Wednesday, deep negotiations between dairy farmer organisations and the government. Deep negotiations between dairy farmer organisations and the government on how to bring in foreign workers may lead to a solution in the next few days, after weeks of delay as details were hammered out. Talks have been tangled further by glaring points of difference in similar critical exemptions granted to 300 teachers, which were announced over the weekend. Dairy NZ General Manager of Responsible Dairy, Jenny Cameron, said the delay in processing applications for the Farm Workers Scheme is related to deep negotiations between the Ministry for Primary Industries, the Ministry for Business Innovation and Employment, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs and Trade, Federated Farmers and Dairy NZ. One criterion still in flux is the level of pay the workers would have upon entry, she said. It's NBR This Week, the top business stories from our daily video news bulletin, NBR Today. From Thursday, an Auckland business consultant dubbed the Wizard of Wealth succeeds in freezing hundreds of thousands of dollars. An Auckland business consultant dubbed the Wizard of Wealth has succeeded in freezing hundreds of thousands of dollars he paid under a defective agreement to a property development associated with serial bankrupt Peter Shevin. Beach Haven's Axel Hendrickson and the business consultancy he alone directs and owns, Millionaire Makers International, were granted freezing and preservation orders this month by the High Court in Auckland. The plaintiff sued Portman Project in late 2020, alleging the single-purpose development company, mostly owned by a trustee company on behalf of high-rise developer Shevin, couldn't legally retain $260,000 it was paid. This is NBR This Week. Now we're up to Friday's top story. US tech, culture and science magazine CNET reported this morning that Oz Hosley, one of Google's first ever 10 employees and a revered figure at the company, had announced plans to work remotely from New Zealand for a year and longer if he liked it. The publication cited an email he sent to employees, which explained that after 3 decades in the US, the originally Swiss senior vice president for technical infrastructure and his wife both felt it was time to consider a new location. To be clear, I'm not retiring, just changing my location, Horsley wrote. You've been watching our review of the week's top 5 NBR Today stories. You can find the full versions of those stories and more, along with all our breaking business news, columns and opinion at nbr.co.nz right now. Saturday, in Fact or Fiction, Grant Walker and Bryce Edwards debate the week in politics. And in Equipment Check, Hayden Green gives his take on the value of 8K TVs. I'm Paul Brennan. Thanks for watching NBR This Week. Have a great weekend. I look forward to being with you again from Monday on NBR Today.